Welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs Conference Call Series. My name is Courtney Brode, Associate Program Officer for East Asia at IGE, and I will serve as the moderator on today's call. Thank you to everyone on the call. Our topic today is Building a Sustainable Environment for Religious Freedom in Laos and the Role of Peacebuilding. Laos is a country that faces complex questions about its development and future, especially issues at the intersection of religion, culture, peacebuilding, and law. Here to help us understand this complexity and the stakes involved is Dr. Stephen Bailey. Dr. Bailey is IGE's Laos Program Officer at the Institute for Global Engagement. Prior to joining IGE, Dr. Stephen Bailey was involved in relief and development work in Thailand and the Laos Democratic Republic for 17 years with Compassion and Mercy Associate Services. From 2001 to 2011, he was Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies and Director of the Alliance Graduate School of Missions at Alliance Theological Seminary in Nyack, New York. Since 2011, Dr. Bailey has served as Professor of Intercultural Studies at Simpson University, where he teaches Community Development and Intercultural Studies. Since 2011, he has served as Program Officer in Laos for the Institute for Global Engagement. His work on religious freedom in Laos focuses on education, creating space for dialogue and relationships between religious leaders and the government, and trainings in peace building. Dr. Bailey has written several recent publications on religious freedom for IGE's Review of Faith and International Affairs, including Ritual, Relationship, and Religious Liberty in Laos, Introduction, Religious Freedom Studies on Asian Nations, Contextual Conversion, an Anthropological Perspective, Laos and Religious Freedom Studies, and the Role of Foreign Organizations in Asia Today. Before we get started, just a few words on today's call format. We'll begin with 20 minutes of remarks from Dr. Bailey, and then we will open the floor for your questions. If you would like to ask Dr. Bailey a question, please press 5* at any point during the call, and you will be placed in the queue. Please also note that this call is on record. An audio recording will be made available on IGE's website. So with that introduction, let's now turn to our call. Thanks again, Dr. Bailey, for joining us today to share from your deep expertise and experience regarding religious freedom and peace building in Laos. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm delighted to be able to discuss religious freedom in Laos with everyone who's called in. Thanks for your interest in this topic that has been of great interest to me for quite a number of years now. I'd like to begin with quickly going through some basic background things on Laos and religion before I discuss the more particular issues of religious freedom in Laos today, and how I think the work of peace building may be a crucial step forward in the process towards a sustainable environment for religious freedom for all the religious communities in Laos. Let me start with 4 basic things I think that you have to know about Laos on any subject. First, it's a very vulnerable country, and there's something I think in the minds of government officials that speaks and communicates a kind of vulnerability geopolitically. And of course, it's a landlocked country surrounded by much larger nations, some of which, like Vietnam, have a real problem with the scarcity of land and very large populations. It's also a country very much in the process of building the idea of a nation state in the minds of its population. The country is only made up, the ethnic Lao only make up about half the population. The rest of the population is a wide variety of ethno-linguistic and religious groups spread out in very mountainous areas. And there's been a long history of very regional authority and politics in Laos that make thinking as a nation, acting as a nation, rather difficult. The third is that the government of Laos, under the direction of the Communist Party, have been trying to move towards the rule of law, at least developing law, at a fairly quick pace over the last 10 to 15 years. But that is a very negotiated process between the concerns for the stability and power of the party and his party, and also the connections, the increasing connections they're making with the international community. Agreements, particularly with the World Trade Organization and ASEAN and the European Union during the last 3 years, have created new obligations to meet criteria for human rights and an open society under the rule of law. And the motivation, of course, moving towards this rule of law is not really a change of politics, but a very determined pursuit for prosperity through development. In the early 1990s, the Communist Party's logo or slogan dropped the word socialism and replaced it with the word prosperity. And since that time, and since the opening to foreign investment in 1989, the country has been at a very quick pace moving towards more and more economic development. But I think the thing to know about even this very successful move towards economic development, they've been growing at just in the last couple of years of 8 and 7% economic growth, and this has been quite typical over the last 10 or more years. But I think the thing to know about Laos is even pre-revolutionary Laos, from about the early 1960s up until today, I think you still have to understand the economics of Laos as kind of a pseudo-economic situation. Foreign aid has been a huge part of the economic stability of Laos during the Vietnam War and post-liberation. And even today, even though much of the economic prosperity has a certain reality to it that perhaps is new, still the enormous amounts of aid, World Bank, Asian Development Bank loans, and foreign investment are playing a huge role in propping up what appears to be more prosperity every year. In terms of religious freedom, the country is known as a Theravada Buddhist country, but of course, since the ethnic Lao only make up a little more than half of the country, there's a lot more at stake religiously in Laos than I think most people perceive. Most of the country practices, including the Theravada Buddhist practice, forms of animism of some type, ancestor veneration, and so the role in Buddhism is largely connected to the ethnic lowland Lao people, although it does play a very important, has always played a very important role in legitimizing political power in Laos, as it continues to do today. There are some minority religions in Laos, and like most Asian nations, the Lao government has given official recognition to just a few. So when we talk about religious freedom in Laos, we're not talking about freedom for all and any religious community, but for those that have been officially registered and recognized by the government. And those would include Mahayana Buddhism, which is relevant mostly to the Chinese and Vietnamese populations there. The Baha'i, which is a very small community of 2,000 or 3,000 people. Islam, which is an even smaller community. And then the Catholic community, which is quite old and probably numbers around 65 to 1,000 to 100,000. And then Protestant Christians, which are broken down into the Lao Evangelical Church and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Protestants probably number around 70,000 to 100,000. So we're talking about very few minority religions and also very small populations of religious minority groups. Most of the concern for religious freedom has been focused on the Christian population, and the large portion of concerns and incidents related to violations of religious freedom over the years have been focused on the Protestant Christian community. Laos has a lot of things in place, actually, from a legal point of view. The Constitution, Article 43, guarantees the freedom to believe or not believe in religion. Article 9 gives the right to religious activity, but also encourages all religious communities to participate in the development of the country. And then very significantly, like a number of other Asian countries, there is an interesting stanza that prohibits all acts creating division between religions and classes of people. And I think this concern with order and with harmony in Laos has been kind of the qualifying issue for almost all of the law and policy written ostensibly to protect religious freedom. The main policy document, Decree 92, goes into details providing for freedom of assembly for religious events, for establishing temples and churches, for appointing religious leaders, and for a number of fairly typical items under religious freedom. The United Nations has recommended that Decree 92 be clarified, and the government went through a very long revision process that the Institute for Global Engagement was very much a part of. And yet that revised document has been held up for about almost 2 years now. It may be that it's being held up because the Constitution is going through another revision. And so there is some hope that after the Constitution is revised, that the new Decree 92, which we hope is more clarified and clear about the rights of religious communities, will come out shortly after. Just looking at kind of the short run at the history of religious freedom in Laos, from about 1975 to 1990, even the Buddhists were laying low. People were often told through the media and other forms of communication that Buddhism needed to demonstrate its ability to participate in national construction. Monks were often criticized as being lazy, that meditative processes in the temple and begging in the morning for food were anti-social. Little money was given to the temples, and if anybody visited Laos during the 70s and 80s, particularly the late 1980s, most of the temples were in very poor repair. And there weren't a lot of men becoming monks, which is highly unusual in a Theravada Buddhist country where becoming a monk for a male is a rite of passage into adulthood. Most of that began to change after 1990. The same could be said of the Catholic and Christian communities. For the Protestants, most of their religious leaders fled the country after 1975, as well as a lot of members of the Christian community. And they laid low. There were gatherings, worship and for some business-type meetings, but they were very small gatherings, very low-key. That all changed once the Foreign Investment Code went into place. In the 90s, we saw the Buddhist community begin to slowly regain their traditional role in society. Men began to go into the monastery again as their typical rite of passage. Money was given to temples. They were being restored. And now, probably over the last 10 years even, we've seen not only a return to the traditional role of Buddhism in Laos, but participation in a lot of important Buddhist ceremonies by government and party leaders themselves. In fact, the party and the government have funded not only some important Buddhist shrines, but the guardian shrine of the national spirit in Vientiane was built with government money and dedicated with government officials present. And although the Communist Party routinely criticizes religion that smacks of what they would think of as superstition, they consider the only legitimate role of religion really to be the teaching of ethics, the teaching of people to participate as good moral citizens, and downplay and even speak against any kind of superstition, whether it's coming from Buddhist monks or Catholic priests or Protestant pastors. And yet, very interestingly, both the Phang statue, the first king of Laos, his statue, when it was dedicated, there were rituals done not only by Buddhist monks but by Brahmin priests going back to pre-Buddhist ritual systems to empower it and dedicate it as a national shrine. The same was done with the shrine that went up just recently for the national guardian spirit of the country in Vientiane. Catholics have been increasingly active post-1990 as well, but not nearly as active as the Protestant community. For them, activity increased really in the repair of Catholic properties, receiving funds from Catholic communities outside of Laos, and reestablishing the seminary in Takak was a very important step for the Catholic community. It took them a number of years of discussion with the Lao government to finally get permission to ordain priests again, but a few have been ordained. And yet I would say that the status of Catholics in Laos is in some ways more precarious with the government than that of Protestants. Although they are not persecuted as frequently, the government has a real concern about the ongoing ties of the Catholic Church in Laos with the Vatican. And there's been a long-standing dispute over the desire of the Catholic Church to put what is essentially a bishop's role, the person appointed in that role, in residence in northern Laos. And that diocese has been rejected by the Lao government. And so the gentleman who serves as a kind of bishop for the northern region continues to live in Vientiane, unable to take up residence in the north ever since the revolution. I won't go into some of the details just now as to what might be involved there. But while Protestants are persecuted more than any other group throughout the country, and that has been true through the 1990s, they have been more successful in engaging the government in dialogue, both closed-door meetings, getting to know important people in the government, and in official Lao Front meetings over the years. So they have, in one sense, a stronger communicational link and a better relationship with key people. And the fact that they are an independent Lao religious community serves them well. And yet, because they're growing, particularly among ethnic minority groups throughout the countryside, in the countryside there have been just a lot of problems related to the violation of religious freedom for these people. In the 1990s, it was acute. There were a lot of pastors arrested, churches closed. Some pastors disappeared. Some we know were killed outright. There was a lot of persecution. Many Christians were forced to sign documents renouncing their faith, and the documents often read, if I return to Christianity, please take full legal action against me. In a sense, the documents kind of created a legal precedent against their ability to return to their faith at a later time. All of that pretty much stopped when we got to the year 2000 and beyond. And since the year 2000, I think most religious leaders would tell you that religious freedom has it has expanded every year. I would say the one year perhaps that things kind of came to a standstill and maybe took a few steps backward was in 2013. My thought about that is that it was kind of a response to the international pressure Laos was under after the disappearance of Ajahn Sombat, the Lao non-government organization expert who disappeared in December of 2012. That created a rather difficult climate, to say the least, in Laos. And so during 2013, there seemed to be kind of a step backwards in terms of religious freedom. But in 2014, I think things stepped forward again. Things seem to be going fairly well this year. I think if you asked any religious leader in Laos today, they would say that they are experiencing more religious freedom now than at any previous time. Some of the indications of an expanded amount of religious freedom would be the increasing number, particularly of Protestant churches and communities. These communities continue to grow, and in most cases, particularly for lowland Lao, are able to get permission to form worshiping communities. More difficult has been getting permission to build churches. This continues to be a difficult process in Laos. There are cases where there has been permission given, but I would say for the most part, any kind of formal request for permission to build a church or even to repair a church is usually not even answered. And finally, if there is an answer, it's usually a denial of permission to do that. Another indicator, I think, of expanded religious freedom, at least coming from Protestant Christian leaders, was the unprecedented celebration of Christmas in 2014 throughout the country. And that was done almost everywhere with formal permission. And many took that as a very good sign. I think the other thing that gives us all encouragement is the increasing willingness of the government to discuss religious freedom through the Religious Freedom Education and Dialogue seminars that IGE has been holding for the last 4 years all over the country, in all but 2 provinces and in many, many districts. Some really good discussions. Some of these seminars are, of course, much better and more open than others, but on the whole, I think the religious community feels, both Buddhists, Baha'i, Catholic, and Protestants, feel like they are having an impact in helping local officials understand what law and policy of the national government is on religious minorities. It also is creating an opportunity for government religious leaders simply to sit down and get to know each other. There's a common meal and open discussion and question and answer times at each of these seminars. So that has, I think, given hope to everybody that the process is going to move forward. Another kind of criteria, I think, that can be used is the number of people who actually are in jail or being held for religious reasons. And the number of people in this category has dropped dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years, year by year. There are very few, if any, over the last 5 or 6 years that I can think of that have actually been arrested and then sentenced to prison time for a religious reason. There are, of course, several cases where Protestants have been held often without formal charges, and then released. Of course, if you follow these issues in Laos, the issue of the about 8 to 10 Protestant Christians that were held in Savannakhet after they attempted to pray for the healing of an elderly woman who had just become a Christian and tried to transport her to a hospital. She died in their care, and then they were charged with murder initially. Those charges were then lowered, and they ended up being released after paying a fine. We, in the Institute for Global Engagement, we have seen that over the last 5 or 6 years, that province, Savannakhet province, has been one of the more difficult provinces. In other words, there have been the most probably incidents of religious persecution there. Of course, there are a lot of Protestant Christians there, Lao, and also ethnic minority groups. They've been there for well over 100 years. They are growing, and there is a fair amount of cross-border activity that I think makes the situation somewhat tense also. In other words, there are mission groups and even Thai Christian groups on the Thai side of the border that do both evangelism and training of Christians in southern Laos, and particularly in Savannakhet and Bakse, Champasak areas. These cross-border ministries are very controversial, not just in the government's eyes, but even in the eyes of the Protestant church in the South. And so this kind of complicates the situation. Of course, a lot of the growth of the Protestant church in the South is among ethnic groups that are kind of held in suspicion and dealt with usually more harshly than if the groups were lowland Lao people. I'm thinking particularly of the Bru and the Oi people in southern Laos. They have had a number of problems. Making that even more complicated, I think, are some actions on the part of Protestant Christians that were not advisable, the burning of Buddhist sacred amulets and images. Sometimes there have been attempts to build churches or repair churches without any effort to seek local permission from authorities or even informing local authorities. And sometimes there have been divisions and disagreements within the Protestant community itself that have made some of these situations much more difficult. On the positive side, let me now move to the idea of peace building, which I think is really, I'm hoping, and I believe is a turning point in the discussion on religious freedom in Laos. We have been able over the years to conduct several workshops at an introductory level on peace building training with the help of the Mennonite Central Committee's what they call the Santipap or peace team. These are 2 or 3 Lao who work for MCC, who were trained by the Mindanao Peace Institute, and who have done a lot of peace-building training among young people in the university system in Vientiane. And we partnered with MCC to begin doing some workshops on peace-building training as kind of a trial run. We had in, I think, 4 or 5 different workshops, about 300 government religious leaders go through that. The response to that was overwhelmingly positive, and that gave us courage to take the next steps. And then we proposed to train a team of Lao peace builders made up of government religious leaders from the national level. And so in 2014, in partnership with MCC, we had a team of about 15 government and religious leaders go through a very effective peace-building training process. During that process, what we learned, what we realized was that unlike what was happening in our religious freedom education seminars, we were not just seeing information gathered and learned, we were actually seeing people's minds changed, and a kind of slow conversion.
The host has joined the conference.
So that process, and then the training of, we've since then trained 4 other Lao at the Mindanao Peace Institute, and we expect peace-building training in Savannakhet with the peace-building team that has been trained, and also peace-building training within every religious organization in Laos for leaders in those organizations, and also in the Lao Front and the Ministry of Home Affairs. Both of these government organizations are responsible for religious affairs, and for home affairs, it's their responsibility is the legal apparatus and implementation of law related to religious freedom. Okay, more to say, but I think I've gone too long already, so let me stop here and take some questions.
Thank you, Steve, for your insightful analysis and perspectives on religious freedom and peace building. You've given us much to think about, and I'm sure our callers are eager to engage with you further on these issues. We will now open the lines for questions from the audience. As a reminder to audience members, if you would like to ask a question, please press 5*. When it is your turn to ask your question, today's call administrator, Lindsay Kuntz, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you may ask it. Lines will be placed back on mute immediately following the asking of a question. Also, please note that if you are in the queue and for any reason decide you no longer wish to ask your question, simply press 5* again and your name will be erased from the queue. Finally, for the sake of other callers, I will ask that when you are called upon, please immediately ask your question rather than providing your own commentary. Lindsay, our first question, please.
Yes, thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Steve, for all of your insight. Our first question today is going to come from Cassandra Harris. Your line has been unmuted, so go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi. Sorry, actually, I'm taking this call on behalf of Cassandra. My name is Faraz. And I'm actually just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about recent incidents of religious violence in Laos, and kind of brief, like, what actions have been taken.
Okay. Most of the religious freedom in the last few years, I would say, is related to what the government would consider unlawful gatherings. But I would say beyond that, most of the incidents of persecution would come from areas where there are not very many Christians to begin with, often provinces that have no or had no Christians and now are beginning to see Christians crop up. This often has to do with ethnic minority groups, not just the religious minority groups. So, for instance, it's been frequent to see some minority groups become Christians, and then their neighbors maybe reporting that they are causing division in the community. Sometimes this has to do with refusal on the part of these people to participate in ancestor or spirit rituals that have to do with agriculture or just the safety of the village. And this can sometimes escalate into people destroying crops of Christian families. Sometimes the local authorities get involved, and in several incidents, communities of Christians have been told they have to leave their land and move to another province where there are Christians already because they're unwelcome in that area. Sometimes these people are able to just hang in there and wait it out, and they're able to stay, and sometimes they've felt like they had to leave, and so they've moved to other provinces, and relatives or other people have been able to help them find new land to farm. And the difficulty with that usually is getting the travel documents and the ID documents to have them recognized through this process. So sometimes they've almost become stateless people internally because none of their documents are reconciled with their location. Now, in terms of what steps have been taken, I'm not sure if you're referring to what steps the government has taken or outsiders. We don't, as an organization, IGE keeps track of religious freedom issues. Sometimes when I have very good information, and I know the government is also tracking the issue and aware of it, I will discuss certain issues to try to encourage them to investigate and also remind them of their international commitments on this issue. I think the other thing, of course, that's done by other organizations is simply to post the information on the web or other kinds of media. I know that a number of international organizations in negotiating trade agreements and membership in their organizations have raised concerns about human rights generally. I am not privy to how often religious issues come into those discussions.
All right, thank you, Steve. Our next question is going to come from Mr. Art Peterson. So, Art, your line has been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, I wonder where violence has occurred. Has the UN become involved at all, or are they removed?
Yeah, well, the special investigator from the United Nations Human Rights Office came to Laos a number of years ago now. Trying to remember exactly what year it was, but she did a very extensive tour around Laos, interviewed a lot of people. She was given wide open access really by the Lao government to religious people, and then wrote about a 30-page report on ongoing issues of concern, the weakness and the lack of clarity in Decree 92. And that document really has kind of become a gold standard for the government. They refer to it in a number of discussions that I have with them as, you know, whatever we're doing with them, one of their interests is to try to address the concerns that were in this document. I think it's also being used by other organizations that deal with the government as kind of a tangible way of setting some goals and trying to address some issues.
Our next question this afternoon comes from Ms. Hien Vu. Hien, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Steve. This is Hien. Thank you so much for a wonderful summary of religious freedom in Laos. I just wanted to hear from you. Do you see the influence from the Vietnamese and Chinese government on religious freedom in Laos? If you do, then how much it is? Thank you.
Yeah, I really don't see the influence from China on this particular issue. There is significant dialogue and even looking to Vietnam for models of how to address the issue well. almost every government official I've spoken with about Vietnam will quickly acknowledge that religious freedom has moved further ahead in Vietnam than it has in Laos. And I think in their minds, that's kind of another motivation to move forward. And while in our minds, perhaps Vietnam is not a model of religious freedom, I would have to agree that on the whole, I think we see more religious freedom for minorities in Vietnam than we do in Laos. I think that the legal apparatus, particularly Decree 92, which there is a very similar document in Vietnam, I think the Lao are watching very closely and trying to learn from that process. And yet my experience with this kind of thing is while the Lao often take formats from Vietnam, they adapt them considerably for their own situation. I mean, one of the things that separates Vietnam and Laos socially quite dramatically is Vietnam is dominated by Vietnamese people, and Laos is not. And so I think in that regard, both the ethnic, cultural, and religious areas are all much more complex for the Lao to deal with.
All right, thank you for your question, Hien. Our next question is going to come from Brent. Brent, your line has been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, Steve. My question is, do you think there's a difference in the way you would characterize response to religious freedom between national and the local leaders, whether that be at the provincial or the village level?
Yes. National leaders, I think, have a much broader perspective on this. They're generally more forward-thinking. They generally understand what each of the religious communities is about. A lot of local leaders really have no idea what Baha'i, Catholics, or Protestants believe at all. In fact, they often have a lot of false information. A lot of even district-level leaders really don't understand at all or partially understand what the laws and guarantees of religious freedom in the Constitution are. I would say local leaders on the whole are primarily concerned with protecting harmony and avoiding division in their villages. And this becomes a very complicated matter quickly because once somebody changes their religious faith and stops participating, particularly in animistic rituals that have to do with the livelihood and the well-being of a community, people get emotional about this and fearful very quickly. Now, what complicates this is at the national level, the party really doesn't recognize this level of religiosity. In fact, they don't consider it religion. They put it under a category of custom or tradition, and often are very critical of it, as I said before, as kind of a form of superstition. But at the local level, I would say this type of religiosity is far more important to local people often than Buddhist teaching itself. So part of this kind of ritual system really demands the full participation of the entire community. And I think one of the challenges of religious minority communities is to find a way to communicate with the larger community on this issue, to try to find a way of communicating their desire to also seek the well-being and good harvests and lots of water for rice and all the things that the larger community is seeking through this ritual system. They have to try to participate in the sense of seeking the same kind of blessing seeking the protection and well-being of the community as a whole and not simply be concerned with their own smaller communities. So just dialogue, communication, I think, will help a great deal. But at the local level really is the biggest part of the problem at this point. And I would like to say, if I haven't already, that the problems of religious freedom in Laos, I think, have far less to do with communist ideology than they do with the religious and cultural systems of traditional Laos. And I think at many levels, Laos is trying to negotiate these kinds of changes.
All right, thank you, Steve. Our next question comes from Marina Barnett. Marina, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. I was wondering, are there any other sectors of Lao society that are experiencing increased freedom? And if so, where do you see this happening? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good question. Of course, the most open and free aspect of Lao society is in the market. And I've often said to business people, if you really want freedom as a business person, you'd go to Laos because it's wide open. There are not nearly the number of taxes and regulations, for better and for worse, in Laos as compared to the United States. So that is the freest part of Laos. I would say in terms of social media and just public dialogue, even local newspapers are becoming increasingly bold in discussing not just, harvests and some of the mundane things that communist media was very well known for in the 80s, but a wide range of issues, cultural issues, even being critical of policies or raising questions about new policies and laws, raising concerns for the environment. So there is an increasing level of discussion and dialogue just in the public in Laos. Now, there are limits to that, obviously, and I think Sombat situation kind of showed everyone where the line was. And I think it has to kind of still stop short of directly criticizing the party and the government in a kind of dishonoring way in public. So as long as you're discussing problems with an attitude to address them and improve the situation, contribute to national development, there's quite a bit of tolerance for that. Even in the meetings I attend, there's a lot of wide-ranging and open discussion on religious issues. I think another area where we see an increasing amount of freedom, or at least public participation to choose, is the increasing number of democratically elected officials. Now, most of these candidates still have to be approved by the party and the government, but there are real elections going on at several levels, and particularly for the People's Assembly. And the role of the People's Assembly has been increasing considerably. Are there limits to what the People's Assembly can do? Yes. Just like in the area of public discussion, there are some lines that can't be crossed. And yet, in the National Assembly, you'll see criticism of policy and direction, raising of concerns. But again, it's a kind of criticism and argument done with a kind of we're all in this together and we're trying to improve things and make things better. But I think that's been very significant. I think it's helped the people of Laos feel better represented, and like there are avenues to voice concerns about some of the things going on. Probably one of the most contentious issues in Laos really has to do with land rights, and that was one of the issues that Ajahn Sombat had addressed before his disappearance.
All right, thank you. So there are currently no more questions in the queue. So to all of our callers, if you happen to have another question, go ahead and push 5 star now. We'll give you about 30 seconds to see if you have any last-minute questions. All right, well then in that case, I'll go ahead and turn the floor back over to our moderator. Courtney, take the floor, please.
Thank you, Steve, so much for your answers to these questions. I definitely learned a lot. And I had just one last question. And you mentioned in your presentation that there's a great concern in Laos for having harmony and creating harmony. And I know that through IGE's programs, we are doing a lot of peace building work. And I know that that's something that is relatively new or is not as robust as it may be in other countries. And I was wondering, what are some of the greatest needs regarding peace building that you see today and then going forward?
That's a good question. I think just on a practical side, one of the real needs to move forward in peace building has been we need a much greater number of trained and capable peace-building trainers who are Lao. Because the Lao who do this peace-building are able to contextualize the material and the ideas of peace-building and really shape them to be palatable and also to relevantly address some of the key issues in Lao society. But I think one of the reasons that peace building is so important anywhere in the world is that it reminds us that a lot of these issues assume the presence of peace, and that peace requires that we not just tolerate one another, but that we understand our mutual obligation to seek each other's welfare. And that takes a kind of conversion. Dr. King once said about peace that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but it's the means by which we arrive at that goal. And I think this is very, very important in terms of religious freedom. And while Laos is certainly not a model of religious freedom, in the perspective of 20 years, we have to recognize the significant steps that have been made towards greater freedom. And as we deal with people who really want to restrict religious freedom or who are prone to violence, then our conversations have to be peaceful still, and we need to, in that process, seek the conversion of these people to a perspective of owning their responsibility not only to people like them or people who agree with them, but to neighbors who are very different and who hold different religious ideas and cultural ideas as well. And I see these face-to-face, in-depth discussions having a very dramatic effect on leaders from both the government and the religious community as we've been able to conduct them.
Thank you, Steve, for this really engaging and insightful conversation. And thank you to our callers for joining us today. I hope you will join us again for our next Faith and International Affairs conference call on Thursday, August 27th, which will feature leading expert and RFIA contributor Dr. Jennifer McCleary-Sills, where we will be discussing religion and child marriage, the theme of our forthcoming fall 2015 review of Faith and International Affairs issue. Also, we welcome any and all suggestions for topics and speakers that you would like to hear from in the future for our Faith and International Affairs conference call series. Please feel free to submit any recommendations through the same way you RSVP'd for this call. And thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.